There is a road sign on Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu that most drivers pass without a second glance. It marks Emily Shane Way, a quarter-mile stretch of asphalt named after a 13-year-old girl who was walking home on the shoulder when a car traveling 70 miles an hour ended her life in an instant. There is no crosswalk there. There has never been a sidewalk there. And in the years since her name went on that sign, roughly 60 more people have died within a few miles of it. This is State Route 1. You know it by another name, the Pacific Coast Highway. 655 miles of the most photographed road in America, and one of the deadliest. Before we get into how this road kills people, I want to know where you're watching this from, and whether you've ever actually driven it. Because I guarantee some of you have white-knuckled a blind curve on this exact highway without knowing its full history. If that's you, drop it in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the roads America drives every day without understanding what they're driving on, subscribing costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep digging. Now, back to the highway, because to understand why it kills, you have to understand how it was built in the first place. Pacific Coast Highway is not one road. It is a stitched-together chain of local routes, sea-level causeways, and cliffside carvings that took the better part of 3 decades to connect into a single line, an engineering patchwork disguised today as one continuous scenic drive. The idea took shape in the years around the First World War, when California had no standardized highway system at all, just a scatter of county roads and private toll routes, and route numbers as we know them today didn't yet exist. A bond measure passed before 1910 got the ball rolling in the South, and the state pushed a wooden causeway through the Rincon coastline near Santa Barbara by 1913. Engineered specifically to beat the seasonal flooding that used to swallow the original road at high tide. But the real challenge, the stretch that would define the highway's reputation for the next century, sat 200 miles north, in a piece of coastline so rugged that early surveyors seriously considered it unbuildable. Big Sur. Further south, near Malibu, the road's history took a stranger detour. A private landowner named May Rindage spent years fighting the county in court to keep a public coastal road off her 17,000-acre ranch, gating off the primitive path that had hugged the shoreline since the 1890s and occasionally vanished under the tide. She eventually lost, and the route through her land became part of what we now drive as Peachy through Malibu. A decision that shaped where the highway's most dangerous modern corridor would eventually sit. In 1919, the state approved what was then called Route 56 to link Carmel to San Simeon through the Santa Lucia Mountains, a slab of coastal range that drops almost straight into the Pacific. Crews spent the next 18 years blasting a road into the side of that mountain range. Convict labor from San Quentin did much of the work, housed in temporary highway camps along the cliffs, and engineers leaned on dynamite rather than heavy machinery for most of the job. Along just the 65 miles between Spruce Creek and the area north of San Simeon, crews blew away more than 10 million cubic yards of solid rock. Workers who returned to repair the road decades later found unexploded dynamite sticks still buried under the pavement. 33 bridges were needed to span the canyons the highway couldn't route around, the most famous being the Bixby Creek Bridge, 320 feet of concrete arch. Poured from 6,600 cubic yards of concrete, hauled in on 825 truckloads, reinforced with 600,000 pounds of steel. When the full route finally opened on June 17, 1937, it was hailed as an engineering marvel. Nobody framed it at the time as a road that would still be killing people 9 decades later. But the same geology that made it spectacular made it dangerous, and that danger was baked into the design from day one. 200 miles north of Big Sur in San Mateo County, that same design flaw produced a section of highway so unstable that California eventually gave up fixing it altogether. The stretch known as Devil's Slide, just south of Pacifica, first lost a section of road to a landslide in 1940, only 3 years after the highway opened. Over the following decades, it closed again and again, 9 separate times across a 28-year stretch, with the longest single closure running 158 days after a catastrophically wet winter in 1995 caused the roadbed to slump 6 feet. In 2006, cracks opened across the pavement itself, warning of an imminent collapse, and Caltrans shut the road for 5 months to stabilize the slope. 20,000 commuters a day depended on that stretch, and every closure meant a detour of dozens of extra miles inland. After a 4-decade political fight between Caltrans and local environmental groups, voters finally approved a permanent fix in 1996. Twin tunnels blasted straight through San Pedro Mountain instead of around it. The Tom Lantos tunnels opened on March 25, 2013, at a final cost of $439 million, and the old Cliffside Road was retired for good, later reopened only as a walking and cycling trail. Devil's Slide is the one stretch of Pacific Coast Highway where engineers eventually admitted the terrain could not be tamed, only bypassed. Here is the mechanism, not just the mood. The highway through Big Sur was carved directly into unstable coastal cliffs, in places barely 24 to 32 feet wide for two-way traffic, with a rock wall on one side and open air on the other. There are no shoulders in most of it wide enough to fully clear a stopped car, let alone let a driver pull over safely to watch the sunset the road was built to show off. The curves aren't just sharp, they're blind, cut around the contour of a mountain that offers zero sightline into what's coming the other way. If a truck jackknifes, or a cyclist drifts, or fog rolls off the water and swallows the lane markings, the driver behind that curve has a fraction of a second to react, on a road with a cliff face on one side and open ocean on the other, and nowhere in between to put the car. Drivers who try to pass a slower vehicle on these single-lane stretches have to cross into the opposing lane blind, betting that nothing is coming around the next bend toward them at the same moment. Further south in Malibu and Orange County, the danger flips entirely. The road flattens out, opens up, and becomes a fast, straight commuter corridor lined with beaches, driveways, bus stops, and pedestrians, carrying nearly 37,000 vehicles a day past the Malibu Civic Center alone, a number that climbs by another 3,000 to 5,000 in the summer months, when tourists unfamiliar with the road merge in among locals who drive it at speed every day. 2 completely different roads, 2 completely different failure modes, 1 route number, 1 continuous ribbon of asphalt that never lets a driver forget which version of the highway they're currently on. Which brings us to the human cost, because construction budgets and cubic yards of blasted rock only tell you the shape of the danger, the way the road was designed to fail. Statistics tell you how often it does fail. Neither one tells you what that failure actually costs a family. The names do. On April 3, 2010, the Saturday of Easter weekend, a 13-year-old girl named Emily Rose Shane left a friend's house in Malibu and started walking down the shoulder of Pacific Coast Highway toward Heathercliff Drive, where her mother was going to pick her up. She never made the intersection. A 26-year-old driver named Sina Konkanian, who had recently lost both his job and his girlfriend, had gotten onto Topanga Canyon Boulevard and driven roughly 17 miles in a state investigators would later call erratic and suicidal, hitting speeds up to 70 miles an hour as he turned north onto Peachey. 6 separate 911 calls came in from other drivers on the road, describing his driving in the minutes before he reached Heathercliff Drive. Witnesses said his car left the roadway entirely, went airborne, and struck a utility pole hard enough to snap it. Emily was killed instantly. She was found 30 feet up the hillside from where she'd been standing. Konkanian survived. He had left a suicide note in the car. The case took 2 trials to resolve, the first ending in a hung jury. Before Konkanian was convicted of second-degree murder in May of 2012 and sentenced the following month to 15 years to life. That stretch of peach, on a section local residents had already started calling Blood Alley for its accident history, had no sidewalk for pedestrians to use instead of the open shoulder. It still doesn't. Not along the full corridor. Emily's father, Michelle Shane, a film and television producer whose credits include major studio pictures, turned his grief into a campaign. He crowdfunded a documentary about the highway's dangers, describing the road to potential backers as something closer to a war zone than a scenic byway, and pushed Caltrans and Los Angeles County to add sidewalks, guardrails, and stoplights along the most exposed stretches. Caltrans, for its part, maintained publicly that the highway wasn't statistically worse than comparable roads, even while acknowledging that specific intersections, including the one where Emily died, needed safety work. Local law enforcement eventually created zone-based patrol enforcement through the sheriff's department, breaking Malibu into sections with dedicated patrol cars, an effort credited with the corridor's first summer without a fatality in years. It didn't last. As recently as last year, when Emily's killer came up for a parole hearing, the governor rejected the request, and her family kept fighting to keep him behind bars. By that point, according to reporting on the case, roughly 60 people had died on that same short stretch of Malibu roadway since the day Emily was killed. Not 60 over decades, 60 since 2010. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Someone who wants the real research behind the road, not just the scary thumbnail. If that's you, the subscribe button is right there. And it genuinely helps a small channel like this keep pulling public records and court documents instead of recycling the same 5 urban legends everyone else does. Because the next case isn't a legend. It's barely 2 years old. October 17th, 2023, a Tuesday night. 4 seniors at Pepperdine University, all members of the same sorority, all set to graduate that spring. We're walking near a stretch of Peachy so notorious for wrecks that locals and law enforcement both call it Dead Man's Curve, roughly 4 miles from campus. A 22-year-old driver named Fraser Michael Bohm was, according to prosecutors, driving a BMW at approximately 104 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone when he lost control and swerved onto the shoulder, striking 3 parked vehicles. Those vehicles were driven into the 4 young women standing beside them. Niev Rolston, 20. Peyton Stewart, 21. Asha Weir, 21. Deslyn Williams, 21. All 4 were pronounced dead at the scene. None of them lived to walk at their own graduation. Pepperdine awarded their degrees posthumously that spring. Bohm was charged with 4 counts of murder and 4 counts of vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence. An unusually severe charge for a traffic case. One the district attorney's office defended at the time by pointing directly to the triple-digit speed involved. His defense has argued the case was overcharged, calling it, in one hearing, never a murder case to begin with, and has fought, so far unsuccessfully, to have the murder counts dismissed before trial. A judge ordered him to stand trial in the spring of 2025, and as of the most recent pretrial hearings in this case, those murder charges still stand, with a trial date still being set. More than 2 years on, the pain has not faded for the people who lived through that night. From the friends who were supposed to meet the 4 women at a party nearby to the first responders who reached the scene. A candlelight vigil now marks the anniversary each October, and the case remains one of the most closely watched in the county. What makes this case land differently than a simple speeding statistic is the geography underneath it. The shoulder where those 4 young women were standing exists precisely because Pacific Coast Highway, in that stretch, was never built with a meaningful buffer between moving traffic and anyone standing still. It's the same design flaw that put Emily Shane in the path of a car 13 years earlier and 4 miles away. Different driver, different decade, same absence of a barrier between the road and the person walking beside it. These 2 cases sit 13 years apart, but they share a pattern that shows up again and again in Malibu's crash data. Between 2015 and 2018 alone, researchers tracking the corridor's injury reports through UC Berkeley's Transportation Safety Database counted 633 injury accidents and 17 fatal ones along that stretch of highway, with a single recent year alone producing 3 fatal crashes and 131 injury accidents tied to causes like unsafe speed, unsafe lane changes, following too closely, improper turns, and driving under the influence. A separate review of a 21-mile section of Peachy through Malibu found 49 fatalities across just 1 decade, from 2012 to 2022. The causes repeat with grim consistency: unsafe speed, drivers glancing at the ocean instead of the road ahead of them, a following distance that closes in an instant when the car in front brakes for a pedestrian or a cyclist. None of it is exotic. It's the ordinary failures of attention and judgment that happen on any road in America, except here they happen on a road carrying tens of thousands of cars a day with almost nowhere to recover from the mistake. No shoulder wide enough, no barrier tall enough, no second chance built into the geometry. Head north past Malibu, past the same cliffs Devil's Slide taught Caltrans to fear, and into Big Sur, and the danger changes shape one more time. This one geological rather than human. Unlike Devil's Slide, Big Sur was too long and too remote to simply tunnel under, so the state has spent 9 decades doing the opposite, rebuilding the same collapsing shoulders again and again rather than rerouting around them. The United States Geological Survey has mapped more than 1,500 individual landslides along just 75 miles of the Big Sur coastline, making it one of the most landslide-prone stretches of terrain in the entire western United States. Local geologists who study the coast can rattle off the names the way a sailor recites buoys: Meckway Creek, Rat Creek, Paul's Slide, Rocky Creek, Pitkin's Curve, Hurricane Point, Mud Creek. Each one a place Caltrans has had to fix over and over across the decades. Caltrans has been fighting this ground for as long as the highway has existed, and in recent years the fight has gotten worse. On January 14, 2023, a slide near a stretch called Paul's Slide dumped roughly 500,000 cubic yards of dirt and rock onto the roadway, closing a 4.3-mile section for a year and a half and costing $60 million to clear. Before that repair was even finished, a second larger slide hit on February 9, 2024. At a location engineers call Regent Slide, originating 450 feet above the road and burying a 6.8-mile stretch so thoroughly that Caltrans had to bring in remote-controlled bulldozers and excavators, operated from a safe distance. because the hillside itself was still actively moving and considered too dangerous for crews to occupy. A follow-up slide in August of 2024 swallowed the initial repair site and forced engineers to restart the project from a different angle entirely. By the fall of 2025, crews had already hauled away 300,000 cubic yards of soil and rock from the Regent's slide site alone, with hundreds of thousands more still to remove before the road could reopen. Big Sur's 71 miles of coast road, cut off from continuous through travel by these two slides, did not fully reopen until January 14, 2026, almost exactly 3 years after Paul's slide first buried it, at a combined repair cost north of $80 million. That is the real character of Pacific Coast Highway. It isn't one danger. It's 3 roads wearing the same name, each one lethal in its own way. In Big Sur, it's a highway carved out of a mountain range that is still quite literally falling into the sea, closing the road for years at a time and forcing engineers to fight geology with remote-controlled machines. In Malibu, it's a fast commuter corridor with no meaningful barrier between 40,000 cars a day traffic and the pedestrians who live, work, and walk along it. A corridor that has taken a life roughly every couple of months for over a decade. And running underneath both of those failure modes is the same original decision, made in the 1930s. To build a scenic coastal route as cheaply and directly as the terrain would allow, prioritizing the view over the buffer, the curve over the shoulder. 90 years of patchwork safety improvements, sidewalks added here, guardrails there. Enforcement zones carved into Malibu after Emily Shane's death have narrowed that gap. They have not closed it. Today, the highway is fully reopened, curve for curve, mile for mile, all 655 of them from Dana Point to Leggett. Tourism has surged back into Big Sur since the January 2026 reopening, with traffic at the southern gateway near Ragged Point climbing more than 900% year over year according to state tourism figures. A sign of just how much the region depended on a road that had been severed for nearly 3 straight years. Caltrans crews are still watching the hillside at Regent Slide for further movement, and officials have been candid that winter storms could force temporary closures again at any time, because the ground there has never fully stopped shifting. Meanwhile, in Malibu, there's been a quieter kind of progress. Broader shoulders in a few of the worst spots, more predictable enforcement, occasional talk of a passenger ferry to pull some commuters off the highway entirely. But the corridor still carries its tens of thousands of daily commuters past the same unshouldered curves where Emily Shane and, more recently, 4 Pepperdine seniors were walking when a car left its lane. The sign for Emily Shane Way is still there. So is the stretch of roadway near Dead Man's Curve. Caltrans has not built a continuous sidewalk along either. If you ever find yourself on Pacific Coast Highway at dusk watching the fog roll in off the water while the road narrows against a cliff face with no shoulder to speak of, remember that the danger isn't in your imagination, and it isn't a myth built for a thumbnail. It was blasted into these cliffs with dynamite in 1937, and it has been quietly killing people in the same predictable places ever since, whether that place is a mile of unstable mountainside above Big Sur or a stretch of unlit shoulder in Malibu with no sidewalk to step onto. The road hasn't changed nearly as much as the drivers on it need to believe. It is engineered into the geometry itself, and no scenic overlook is worth outdriving your sightline. Slow down before the curve, not during it, and give the person walking on the shoulder more room than the white line requires. If you've driven this road yourself, or if you knew someone who didn't make it off, tell that story in the comments below. Some of the most important details on this highway never made it into any official record. They only survive because someone chose to remember them.